Thank you, Kathy. Really excited to have a chance to come talk to you today. I'm really grateful for that opportunity. I'll just share my screen and let me know if you have any trouble seeing that. But today we're going to talk about improving IT services contracting outcomes and talk through maybe a perspective that I think it's coming up for you that is a little unique, right? Like I'm from the IT services side of the equation, right? I've worked for IT services companies for the length of my career, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how we see these kinds of transactions from that perspective. So hopefully that's coming up.
I got it on my screen.
Great, thanks, Chris. So like I say, I've been working in technology for about 15 years. I actually just recently earned an MBA where I studied in finance and strategy, and particularly how finance can drive strategic decisions for businesses. So this IT services and procurement world is kind of a great marriage between my work experience and my education experience. And that's kind of what I'm excited about talking about this. And then I, through my role at Longview, running some strategic accounts for them, got to know Chris, and the two of us were talking about, what are some best practices for doing this, and that's how this presentation came together. So, Chris, you want to say something and introduce yourself too?
Sure, although I don't think I can do as well of an introduction as Kathy did for me, so thanks, Kathy. As Steven and Kathy mentioned, I'm the procurement director at Alterra Mountain Company. I've known Steven for several years now. Very exciting to talk about this today. And I'm intending on providing some commentary just from like a buyer perspective, kind of the things that go through my mind when engaging with an IT service provider. I've done several of these kind of related RFPs, and hopefully can provide some of that context to what Steven will be talking about from a buyer perspective.
Great, thanks, Chris. So the first thing we're going to do with this presentation is we're going to kind of overshare, right? I'm going to talk through some of the cost models that we use when we create proposals for projects and for managed services, and just how the numbers fit together that ultimately end up being the bid response that you all receive. I also have Get Uncomfortable, and there's some great questions that we put together for that could both be asked of people within your organization, your IT department, that are asking for assistance with the bid, making sure that you get it structured in a way that it can be successful, and also some uncomfortable questions that your IT services provider might not be excited that you're seeing or that they're being asked of, right? That might point to some of the information that we're oversharing about. And then we also want to make sure that it's useful and directly impactful to your day-to-day lives. So we're going to strategize and apply it to the list of IT services provider that you currently have, and make sure that it's real for you too. So I think we mentioned this before, but please do interrupt us with questions through the chat or through our meeting. Either is fine. A conversation or discussion is probably going to be the most interactive way to do this. So I have a couple of slides to talk about just the groundwork, just to lay the foundation of what we're even discussing here today. So I wanted to cover what I mean by IT services. A great analogy for this is IT services are kind of like if you hire a landscaping company to put in a new garden in your backyard, right? When you do that, when you go through that process, the first thing you're going to do is probably pull out a big sheet of paper and do some drawing and think about where the pathway is going to go, where the fountain's going to go in, where the plants are going to go, which trees are going to be planted where, that kind of thing. And for IT services, that's project and staff augmentation covering the architect phase. So you can do that one of two ways, right? You can go to Home Depot and just talk to somebody in the aisle and get some free advice that way. And that's equivalent in the IT services world to pre-sales or discovery engagement with the sales engineer. Or you can hire someone, a landscape architect, to do the design work, and that's also possible. It's usually done for more complex projects, like moving a data center from here to there, or implementing a new ERP system, that kind of thing. But either one of those ways, either for the free services that get included with the procurement, or through hiring someone specifically for that work. The next phase is procurement. You're going to go out and you're going to buy all the plants and all the stones and that kind of thing to do the garden. Same thing with IT services, obviously. You'll buy hardware, you'll buy licensing. Implementation, so this is having the labor to go out and pour the concrete and put the stones down, plant the plants, that kind of thing. It's also covered through project and staff augmentation, so it's services, contractual services to handle that. And then managed services finally, so that garden needs to be cared for, weeded, watered, the sprinklers need blown out once a year, that kind of thing. And that's through a managed services agreement. The equivalent would be, covering just the care and feeding of the technology environment that you might have. So things like maybe your service desk is outsourced, or your help desk is outsourced, or maybe just taking care of the network, or it could be a number of different things. So IT services really, it's project and staff augmentation, it's procurement and licensing, and it's managed services, and those are the three different areas we'll talk about today. So this talks about why do we do this in the first place, right? Like, why not just have all of the resources that you use to deliver these projects and these managed services internally? And there's three big reasons for not doing that, right? For engaging with a partner like Longview or like me. The first one is that building out this kind of capacity can be really expensive. In the garden analogy, you could go out and you could buy your own concrete mixer for a couple $1,000s and pour it that way, but you really don't need the concrete mixer after you finish the project, and it's pretty expensive to do in the first place. And you can go out and build a team of people who are talented at landscaping. That's really expensive to do, really difficult. So what you really want to be able to do is to lease the time of those individuals and lease the time with that equipment, and that's something that IT services providers can do, because we're focused on delivering that. That's our core business. Access to talent is probably the #1 reason. So some of these roles are very difficult to fill. Sometimes it's a temporary need for a couple of months. Sometimes you're looking for people who have done a really specific thing or a specific type of project for your kind of company. So finding that talent and building it internally is very difficult to do. Hiring a partner makes much more sense. And then finally, need for focus. Your CIO is probably not going to hit his bonus if he has the service desk working well, or if servers get patched on time. So getting that managerial task off of his plate and onto a service provider makes some sense as well. Yeah.
Hey, Steven, I have a question for you. So using kind of the garden analogy and kind of this slide, so if I am a buyer that might not have a really robust procurement department and have a buyer that specializes in purchasing IT services, how would I develop out an RFP that kind of incorporates all of those elements of a garden, including some sort of discovery or pre-sale, while still maintaining like a competitive solicitation process?
Yeah, I think you want to be really clear on what you're trying to achieve, right? And what phase of the deployment you're in. So if there's any question on what the system needs to look like down the road, then it might make sense to break out that architecture design phase into its own RFP and into its own bid process, and then have that vision totally developed before bidding out the implementation work or the managed services work down the road as well. That might be a good way to approach that. Yeah, and I think also a good point to make here is for whatever reason brings you to the table or brings you to the market to find an IT services provider, make sure that you're really getting that out of the solicitation and out of the providers that you're working with. So if you really think, if you're really interested in systems that automate a big portion of this and the kind of cutting edge technology that can be used to manage systems, then make sure that they have those things in place and that they're not just relying on talent, and vice versa. If it's more of a, you just want some really smart guys to work on a project, then maybe, when you're choosing between the vendors, make sure you're getting the thing that you're shopping for.
Gotcha.
Some thoughts. So those are our foundational slides, for what IT services are and why the industry exists in the first place, that kind of thing. The next section is going to talk through the cost models. So this is the part where we're oversharing a little bit. And I'm actually going to, as much as I can, with some limitations of some contractual agreements that we're in, talk about what costs come together, how the pricing comes together that you ultimately receive on the bid response. So we'll go through procurement, that's the buying of hardware and software. We'll go through project work, which is like CapEx kinds of things. And then we'll go through managed services or the general, maintenance and operations of the technology. So the procurement and sales process, this is probably familiar to everybody. On the left-hand side, you're gonna have the client-facing kinds of activities that you're aware of and that, it's probably a part of your day-to-day life. So client-facing, the client probably identifies some kind of need that they have. They're replacing endpoint protection, they're moving a data center, whatever that might be. There's some vendor engagement. They're going to talk to 2 or 3 different vendors. Pre-sale support, probably the sales engineers from each of those vendors are going to get involved and are going to help design the solution to some extent. A quote gets presented. There's some negotiation. Eventually it gets approved. A PO is cut, and then down the road it gets delivered. The phase that happens behind the scenes or behind the curtain, from my perspective, includes a couple of these steps. So first of all, there's a fair amount of prospecting work that goes on. So we're going out, we're hosting events, we're buying everybody's stakes and talking about projects. We're calling into companies, that kind of thing. A sales team may be assigned, if it doesn't come in, assigned to a specific account manager, which happens. And then there's this registration process after the pre-sale support. And this is really what I want to kind of focus on. Pre-sale support is when a sales engineer comes in and helps design a solution. That's a bit of an investment by the value-added reseller, or by the vendor that's selling the product, right? Because we're providing access to very high-level technically skilled people to help design the solution without any kind of, we're not being paid directly for that. We're being paid down the road by handling the transaction. So there's a process called registration. And what that basically means is that when I engage with a client, I reach out to the manufacturer that I'm going to be representing their product with. And I tell them, hey, I'm working with Alterra, or I'm working with whoever the client is. And this is the kind of deal that we're talking about. These are the products that they're looking at. And they say, okay, great. And they make a note in their systems. And that gives me access to some preferred pricing models, or more pricing models, certainly. In some cases, more pricing models than what the direct reps would have, and people who work directly for the manufacturer. What that does is it lowers my cost of goods generally and makes me more competitive with everyone else who comes in down the road. So for example, if I had a lot of conversations with client A and dedicate a lot of time through prospecting and through pre-sale support, and then client A, and I do a registration, and then client A reaches out to vendors X, Y, and Z and tries to get competitive quotes with those people. The manufacturer or the publisher of the product will provide higher cost of goods back to those other competitors. So my cost of goods are going to be lower, and that makes it so that I am protected. My investment in pre-sales is protected against competition coming in and undercutting me at the last minute, that kind of thing.
Hey, Steven, I have a couple questions on that, if you don't mind. Because, registration is something that I ran into when I was just starting to get into the world of IT buying. It was brand new to me. And so what prevents, if I'm out there shopping for a potential IT partner, do the pre-sales work, I guess what prevents one IT supplier or one IT services provider from kind of getting a whiff of this and then going to, a dealer or a manufacturer and saying, hey, I'm going to be doing this registration with Alterra Mountain Company, when we're still in the IT partner shopping process, and thus preventing a different IT partner from kind of getting access to that?
Yeah, and for many manufacturers, it really is first come, first serve. So I probably shouldn't name names, but there are manufacturers out there where, for the flimsiest of excuses, a company can try to get registration. Now you can, the customer can request the registration be passed to somebody else. You can say, I don't want to work with this client, I want to work with this company instead. It can be very difficult to get that to happen because everyone gets ticked off when that goes down. but it is possible to move that around. I think just there's a point here made on the left-hand side too, is that there's this old style of doing 3 bids and a buy, right? And sometimes there's a a governance kind of reason for doing that. The first bid, if they have registration, will almost always win, so long as it's like for like equipment, right? So long as it's exactly the same SKUs, that bid is always going to come in less expensive.
So would you then, probably break out your partnership process or your solicitation process into 2 different kind of steps? One being selecting a partner first to hammer down kind of the service angle of it, and then once you have the partner, then you're looking at, the equipment pricing part of it.
Yeah, and there's several ways to do that. There's something called the Procurement as a Service Agreement, which is something that we do through Longview, of course. But what that basically is you establish a preferred vendor for everything, right? You're going to pass all of your licensing or all of your hardware through this specific vendor, and then that vendor, in exchange for it, can depend on that revenue coming in and can really partner and lean in and kind of sit on the same side of the table, so to speak, with you. And then what that partner does is provide transparency in the pricing. So client A might know that they're always going to see an 8% markup off of the registered price from Longview, right? If we have a procurement as a service agreement in place, and that kind of gets all that registration stuff out of the way and all the competitive stuff out of the way, so that the vendor and the client can really just work toward the client's benefit.
Okay,
so that's one way of choosing which vendor. Yeah, go ahead.
So if I'm searching for an IT services partner and I know that registration is going to be a factor in this, am I safe to assume that all partners, all IT service providers are more or less treated equal in the eyes of the manufacturer, or is one going to have a substantially better registration cost than another, and therefore if I partner with that person, I'm kind of digging myself into a pricing hole?
Yeah, that's a good question. The level of partnership that a VAR, a value-added reseller, has with a manufacturer can also influence the pricing that they receive. So if you're a platinum partner or a gold partner, your pricing is probably better than if you're a silver partner or bronze, or it kind of depends on which provider you're working with.
So do you often see RFPs come in that require you to state your partnership level with various manufacturers?
Yeah, that can happen, sure. And that makes sense, especially if you're looking at a specific manufacturer. In some cases, you might be looking at a broad set, like as a procurement as a service agreement. You're more interested in how many different manufacturers the person's a partner with than just thinking about a specific one.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So this slide talks through graphically what this really all means. So for procurement, right, for buying hardware and licensing, you can see that the bulk of the cost is that yellow box, is the manufacturer's cost. They're taking 70–80% of the retail price that you're paying. There's a distributor or a distie, right? And the distributor's role is to be the interface between the value-added reseller and the manufacturer. So, like for example, Longview works with literally hundreds of different manufacturers and publishers of software. For us to establish independent relationships with all of those companies would be very onerous. Likewise, manufacturers might work with hundreds or thousands of value-added resellers. For them to establish relationships one-on-one with all of them would be very onerous and wouldn't make sense. So the distributor is the company that sits in the middle and provides us access to products and manufacturers access to a channel sales model. So for that, they take a couple points, 2, 3, 4 points off of each sale, and that's just a tax that has to be paid essentially. And then the 2 boxes, the pink and the purple, that's the margin that goes toward the reseller. So the pink box might be 8–10 points marked up off of the unregistered price, and then a registration might be 10, even 20 points depending on the manufacturer, and some portion of that could be a back-end rebate, right? So a back-end rebate being monies that are paid to the VAR a month or 2 afterwards, after the process, after the transaction's been processed. So we I guess as VARs, we get a lot of push on the on the pink box, right, on what the margin is and can you be more competitive there. But there's really three areas that create additional cost and waste that I think are bigger levers and bigger ways to make sure that you're getting the most value for what you spend. There's three different errors that can be made that I've listed out here. The first one is overbuying. So I have an example of a small mid-sized business that bought licensing for staff plus growth, right? For 20%, we're going to grow by 20%, so we need to license all of them for a year from now. And then they never deployed it beyond the pilot. So if you're wrestling with me over 2-3 percentage points in the pink box over there, but you never use the software that you buy, the bigger lever is making sure that you're using the licensing that you're buying. Another version of that I should mention is for SaaS products or for cloud products that are consumption-based, meaning products that don't require some kind of annual pre-commitment. There needs to be a regular auditing of your consumption to make sure that you're not overpaying for licensing that you're no longer using. So as an example, if you haven't pre-committed for your Office 365 licenses and you're able to make adjustments to that month to month, then having some kind of process in place to audit how many licenses you actually have that are kind of on the bench and unused makes a whole lot of sense, because you can actually have that cost mimic the number of employees that are coming and going in the company. We saw a lot of that, especially at the front of the pandemic, was right-sizing those agreements. Second example is unused features. There was a hotel that I worked with that bought that Office 365 E5 SKU, which included business intelligence and security and the full Office suite and a whole bunch of other things. But really, all they needed was an F1 SKU, which is a frontline worker SKU, for about 75% of their employees, people who were, manning the desks. Is someone who's, working the concierge office, do they really need access to all the security stuff and the BI reports? Probably not. So making sure that you're using just the features that you need and that you're buying software with just or hardware with just the features that you need is pretty important. And then the final one is short-term thinking. I actually had this happen where a large oil and gas, mid-sized oil and gas company, there are some big ones out there. Mid-sized oil and gas company reached out and bought a very nice order from me from some data center hardware, and ended up going to the cloud about 12 months later and mothballing all of the hardware that they had just bought. So, make sure you have a roadmap and a plan for where you're going with the technology so you can avoid some of that waste.
So Steven, so from like a buyer perspective, how would you articulate that as cost savings if you're trying to, make a competitive solicitation and an objective evaluation? How do you kind of translate some of those gray boxes into demonstrating that, the vendor that you're going with you're more focused on kind of the best value rather than the specific lowest dollar price of a unit? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, I think it has to do with that pre-sales process, and it has to do with the ongoing audit of what you're actually buying, right? So if you have IT departments end up developing relationships with vendors, and sometimes these are very collaborative relationships that last for years and years, and they get to know the environment really well and can make really solid recommendations. That's a great way to avoid some of that cost. If you're writing a new RFP, you might put in things like how will you continuously audit our environment to ensure that we're not overspending? Those are great questions. Or there might be, a separate effort, like some kind of VMO effort that needs to be handed off to a specialist, an IT services provider that's more familiar with all of this. Yeah. So we have vendor registration always wins the deal so long as the equipment's identical. Most waste relates to overbuying unused features and short-term thinking. And then we also recommend documenting the process and auditing your buying decisions, right? Which I know, Chris, is something that we talked about, is making sure you have the right kind of sponsor in place who's able to go through and make sure that the company is continuing to get the right kind of value for what they're spending on an ongoing basis, right? Mm-hmm. Probably something you put together at Alterra. So next thing to talk through is the project side, right? And there's really two components that lead to project pricing. So project is, the equivalent for the garden metaphor is hiring people to actually, pour the concrete, put the pavers down, plant the plants, plant the trees, that kind of thing. So that's project work. So this might be deployment of the new ERP or Office 365, new core switch upgrade, stuff like that comes through. So the two different levers you have is the rate that you're charging per consultant hour and the number of hours to get estimated per project. In terms of consultant rate structure, there's first of all the salary, which is pretty obvious, right? You have to pay the employee to work for the company. I have $150,000 here. That's probably a pretty high-end consultant, pretty senior guy who's been doing this for a while. And if I take $150,000 and divide it by 2,000 working hours per year, you end up something like $75. And I'm thinking through this. I want to make sure that this applies to really all different roles, right? If you're looking for a service desk person, someone new in their career who's making $30,000, $40,000 per year, the same kind of math is going to apply to them as applies to these high-end consultants. It's just these are the different, I'm trying to list out the different factors that go to calculating the rate. So salary is first, benefits, let's say it's 30%, something like that. That adds to the cost. So we give a cost of goods or a burn rate of $195,000 per year in this case, or $98 per hour. The next line though is very important, and that's the bench rate. So consultants don't bill for all of the time that they're working, right? They're going to be, at some point they have to work on internal projects, they have to fill out HR forms, they have something that comes up, and that's going to lower their utilization rate from 100% down to like 80%, which is the target that we have at Longview. So that means I have a 20% cost that I have to pay for that consultant to cover the time that they're idle or that they're not billing. So that creates a cost of roughly $39,000, right? 20% of the total burn rate. So that gives me a cost of goods two, or kind of a second calculation for 234. I'm then going to look for a contribution margin. I'm going to look for sales, general, and administrative costs to come into it for 30 and 20%, something like that. And that gives me a floor price of $424,000, which is the amount of revenue that I really need to see for a consultant. I'm going to pay $150,000 per year to. So that's $209 per hour. I'm going to go out into the market and say I want $250 per hour for this individual. And depending on the negotiation, depending on who the client is, or what the kind of work being performed is going to be, you may be able to get me down to 209, something like that. Anything lower than 209 is probably going to have to be a pretty good reason for it, and I'm probably going to need higher level approval to get that to happen. But I guess the thing to take from this is if you need some kind of staff aug role, if you're looking for someone to come in as a network consultant, you can go out and figure out what network consultants make in the world if you were to hire one, and then do the math to figure out what probably that company's minimum floor price is going to be, and that empowers you to make to negotiate a little bit harder when you're talking to the vendor too, trying to place the person. Next section to talk through is the work breakdown structure. So let's say this isn't staff augmentation, meaning it's not just providing a body at a rate, but actually we're going to try and deliver a specific project, a specific deliverable. We're going to go through in that pre-sales process, and we're going to develop a series of milestones, and then the subtasks that are required to complete each milestone. So we'll make estimates for each of the milestones and which roles are required. So let's say we think it's 20 hours of architect time, it's 12 hours of a junior person's time. Milestone 2 is 40 and 40. Milestone 3 is a little bit of architecture, but a lot of junior processing. You can see, and these are made up numbers, of course, but you can see how this comes together to a total number of hours for each of those roles. So in this case, 96, 156, and 84. We then add the fudge factor, which is the percentage we add in case things go south and we have to take care of them. And that fudge factor is going to vary considerably from company to company. But let's say it's 20%. And that gives us a SWAG, which is an acronym that we use at Longview, and I'm not sure if this is industry term or not, but it's scientific wild ass gas is what that acronym stands for. We multiply the swag by the rate. That gives us the total per consultant. It all comes together and forms the price that we estimate for the work, right? So most of our projects at Longview are going to be time and materials. So we make an estimate of what we think things will cost based on our prior experience. It's a scientific wild ass guess, right? There's also a model, right, where you see a fixed fee or a fixed rate. We think it's going to cost $100,000, and if it takes more time than this, we won't charge you for anything extra. If it takes less, we're not going to charge you for anything less. Generally at Longview, we steer clear of that, and I'd probably recommend that for everyone here too, unless it's the kind of project that has been done over and over and over by the same vendor, you know, some routine kind of thing where they really do know exactly how much time it takes. And the reason I recommend against it is because of that fudge factor. We're going to estimate 20% for a time and materials project. If it's a fixed fee engagement, that might be 40%, it might be 50%. And we're not going to hand back the extra percentages at the end of the project if we end up overestimating the amount of effort or if the fudge factor wasn't necessary. So fixed fee projects, in my experience, almost always result in a client paying more than they could have paid if they were, you know, willing to do time and materials.
So, Steven, this is where I think buyers can get caught up in a fair amount of the weeds here, because it looks like they have a couple layers of complexity to those two grids you have. So if I'm doing an RFP for a project and I'm doing, you know, at the number of hours plus an hourly rate, not only would I have to negotiate an hourly rate, I'd have to understand what the realistic number of hours is, you know, for each milestone, plus figure out a way to make an apples to apples comparison between vendor A architect or whatever they name it versus vendor B architect. And how I usually accomplish that is by basically just, you know, writing out what my expectations are for the role, right? So if you have an IT person on staff that can kind of direct you and say, hey, we expect the architect to perform these general tasks. That way you can kind of keep that role in the same lane, so you're not getting such a wild variable between vendor A and vendor B on those. Do you have any other kind of guidelines that folks can use to make sure they're making an apples to apples comparison?
Yeah, man, like what you said, if two quotes come in and they're wildly different, it's not going to be a rate kind of thing. It's not one vendor providing you a deal and the other one's not providing you a deal. I mean, the math is the same for both vendors. So it has to be that the way they're estimating the milestones is significantly different. And that's where the variance is coming from. It could be that the less expensive vendor has some kind of process they developed or some kind of secret sauce that shortcuts it. That does happen, but it's probably not very common. What's more common is probably someone's underestimating or someone's overestimating what's required. And then I'll add this to it as well is, you know, you notice the 96, 156, 84, none of those numbers are 160 exactly, right? Which would be 40 hours per week times 4 weeks covering a month, right? All of these are going to be fractional resources, which means that I have to have these clients or these consultants on multiple projects to fill out that 80% utilization. So it's very tempting sometimes to hire or to assign an architect to cover all of the work that needs to be done, including things that are really pretty junior and that level of skill set isn't necessary for. So understanding how that, and you don't want to pay for that, right? You don't want to pay for a very senior guy to do data processing kinds of things. So understanding what goes into the WBS and where the disparity is between two vendors really makes a lot of sense. Right?
So
it's a challenge, but it's important.
I mean, is it realistic to ask the vendor to provide, you know, some semblance of logic or explanation as to, you know, what brought them to their hours calculation? You know, if you go to one and say, hey, it looks like you're quoting me 40 hours, you know, can you kind of tell me why you chose an architect to do 20 and another to do 12 or something like that? Is that something the vendor should be able to provide?
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely inbound question. and a good one to ask, right? Like how does the math actually come together for each of these milestones, and try to get as much transparency as you can get. Sometimes this is uncomfortable for the vendor, right? Because if we commit to a certain number of hours per milestone and we're off, we're usually off a little bit from one milestone to another, it's harder to push that budget of hours from milestone to milestone. And whereas if we haven't committed to a WBS, it's easier to be kind of fudge it and make it right. So I think it's an important question too, because of the second point made in that green box. And that is sometimes a vendor will underbid a project, and what they're essentially doing is they're trying to buy the business, or they're trying to, it's maybe an underhanded technique, right? You underquote, and then you get a little ways into it and say, oh, well, I didn't know you had this thing in place, and you PCR the company to death, and the total cost of the project after all the PCRs ends up being greater than what you would have paid the company to bid it properly the first time. So something to guard against, I guess, to make sure that the vendor you're working with really knows how to quote the project in the first place and how these numbers should go together.
So is it
reasonable
then, if you're doing a project that's like kind of this level of complexity and there's a high risk of change requests, is it reasonable to have like a discovery process first, and have them have the IT provider develop a hours proposal based off of the discovery process, and then more or less say that any PCR that comes later kind of indicates a failure in the discovery process, and the company wouldn't be liable for that change request?
So I would absolutely say it makes sense to have, to break out complex projects and have the discovery and the architecture work be a separate project than the other. You'll be hard pressed to find a company that will be willing to write that fixed fee based on the discovery, making sure the discovery is that thorough, just because this stuff is really hard and there are a lot of variables that are hard to anticipate. And I think what you end up doing when you ask for that is having that fudge factor get inflated up into that 40%, 50% range, and you'll end up paying the premium anyway. But I do think it's in bounds to make sure that everyone's working off of at least a similar WBS when they provide the quotes back.
Perfect.
Great. So that's project. That's going to be the kind of work to do, implementations. The next thing to talk through is managed services. So this is the category of work that would be ongoing maintenance of systems, ongoing support of technology, that kind of thing. Let's see, I am not able to see if there's questions coming through. So maybe Chris, if you're able to see that, let me know. I don't want to, railroad over the top of somebody.
I don't see any questions in the chat.
Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about the cost model behind managed services to provide some transparency there too. And I have the iceberg metaphor there. So most people think about the part above the waterline on the iceberg, which is the customer-facing employees, right? You have, if you're doing service desk, I know that there's 6 people who work for the service desk. I know what you would pay these individuals. You multiply one times the other and end up with what the cost could be at first glance. What that doesn't appreciate maybe is that there are things like systems and technologies and processes that underpin the way that a company delivers service desk, and those things have costs as well, right? And those things, also provide quite a bit of value. That's a lot of the secret sauce, and that's a lot of what you pay a vendor to provide. So customer-facing employees are above the waterline. Just below it is that ITSM platform, which is IT service management. It's a technology used for managing tickets and problems and incidents and things like that. It's monitoring, it's automation. Longview just made a huge investment of a couple $1 million into a new automation tool. That's the equivalent maybe of buying that concrete mixer. It makes sense for us to do it because all we do is mix concrete, or all we do is take care of tickets. It may not make sense for an individual company to do that. We have a service management office. That's a part of our organization that's responsible for creating processes, and every vendor will have something like that too, or hopefully they'll have some kind of process organization. And then we also have some kinds of costs that are way underneath the waterline, like churn and bench. Clients come and go. We have to have a little bit of downtime because of that. Or there might be an emergency, right? That's a lot of what you pay for out of a managed services agreement, is the ability to have a vendor swarm a problem. So that means I have to have people on the bench so that they're available to swarm a problem if something comes up. And then there's SG&A and general overhead kinds of things. So all of those different factors end up getting factored into, or all those different costs end up getting factored into the price that we present when we do a managed services agreement. It usually ends up being equivalent or hopefully less expensive than running things internally. But the costs come in terms of the investment in the tool set and the processes, less so than, and the savings as well, less so than paying the employees that we have any less than what you guys are paying directly.
I think
so.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No problem. I need a breath and get some water anyway. Go ahead.
I would say from a buyer perspective, I think that, what I would be looking at is just the top and second layers there, the customer facing employees and the platform monitoring and automation. The second layer there is really not something that, early on in my career, I would have thought to ask. I would mostly be concerned with what the face value cost of whatever service is, like a per ticket fee or a per hour fee. And I'm finding more and more that the second layer there is becoming important, because you want to understand if your supplier is investing in products and services in their internal organization that will eventually drive down the cost of what you pay, right? So if you're moving forward with a ticketing supplier and it's a per ticket fee, are they using some software to be able to monitor and categorize the tickets so you can address the underlying problem and reduce the overall number of tickets and kind of lower your costs? So I think that's becoming more and more important when you're looking for like a longer term managed services partner.
Yeah, and those are things that get built into agreements with increasing frequency, right? Like targets. We want to see a 20% decrease in ticket volume per employee over the course of the next year, and that's done through creating what's called Tier 0, or documentation, public-facing documentation that prevents service desk tickets from coming in. Or likewise, if automation is going to be implemented, maybe it's appropriate to ask for the vendor to share in that cost, right? Because if you're paying for them to implement some kind of automation tool, shouldn't you see a reduction in your managed services fees over the course, of the term of the agreement? I think that's fair to ask for. And there's a point there too that says just make sure you're getting what you're paying for. If you're hiring, a company because you really want that automation stuff that you, and that's the value that you see in having a managed services provider, then make sure that they have that stuff in the first place, and that it's in the contract, and that it's being delivered using the tool set that you want to see.
Correct.
Yeah. I also have service maturation is more important than consultant team fit. Probably the way the whole works together is more important than the individuals. And then scale, experience, and profitability really are critical. Make sure you have the vendor who's done this kind of work before at the scale that you're at, and that they're profitable in doing that, so that they're incentivized to continue investing in it. Okay, so those are 3 different cost models for project, managed services, and procurement. My mouse is lost. Next thing to go through is going to be some uncomfortable questions, both for your company and for the vendor. So these are the things that hopefully point toward risk, I guess, is really the purpose behind this. So we'll send the deck out afterwards, because there's quite a number of questions we've written down here, but I did want to highlight a few that that we feel are fairly important. So when you're deciding whether or not you want to work with a vendor in the first place, these are questions you're asking your own company. The first question really to ask is, do we understand the problem that we're trying to solve? Unfortunately, it's tempting for technology people to end up being attracted to technology for technology's sake and to lose track of what business problem you're creating or what business problem you're solving with that. So making sure that they understand the connection between the two, and that the project that you're proposing is one that creates that business value. That chain really needs to be, quite tight in order to get the most value out of the agreement. Yep.
Can I talk on the deciding to work vendor, to work with the vendor side? The bullet point on the bottom is particularly interesting to me, that who is the executive sponsor. So I would say, one of the additional questions you should ask is not only who's the executive sponsor, but who's kind of going to be the business owner from an operational perspective, because I found executive sponsors are great to bat away some of the red tape and bureaucracy in the company to get things done, but they might not necessarily be the most equipped to make, the right decisions for the, tough questions you might have to ask that vendor. So I think it's always important to make sure that the buyer's liaison is the person, or the person the buyer liaisons with is the basically business owner, and not necessarily the executive sponsor in that case.
Yeah, my most successful engagements and the clients that are where those relationships are really mature, generally have close relationships with the primary contact, where we get to be very close, and there's a great deal of dependence on one another, and that's really what makes these kinds of things successful. So when you get into the shopping phase, right? Another thing to look at is, why would this vendor invest in me? Something called Pareto's Law, or the 80-20 rule, that gets thrown around a lot, right? And that's the rule is that 80% of your outputs come from 20% of your inputs. And that's true for everyone, including the IT services, account manager and company. Very much for me, and my paycheck I receive, 80% of my income comes from 20% of my clients. And what that means is that if a client calls me up and they're part of my 20%, and they call me up on a Saturday, then I will drop what I'm doing and I will chase down whatever issue they need, because I'm incentivized to do that. If a client calls me and they're not part of my 20%, I'm probably still going to take the call, because that's just how I run things. But you have to acknowledge that my incentives aren't aligned quite right to take care of some of the smaller clients that don't fit in that 20%. So when you're looking at a managed services company in particular, it's tempting to go with one of the giant companies like an IBM or HCL or something like that. But I think a great question to ask is, am I part of their 20%? If things go south, can I get the CEO of that company on the phone? And if the answer is no, they don't really care about the business, then you might think about making sure you find a vendor that really does value the business.
I actually like to go a little bit more granular as well when I'm, writing a scope of work, or going through the negotiation phase of an evaluation. I like to ask, who's going to be my primary contact once the contract is closed, and then go to that person and say, how many clients are you actually servicing right now? Am I going to be one of 100 for you, or am I one of 5? And that can also kind of lead to understand what level of service you come to expect. So that's another question that I think kind of runs along that same line.
Yeah, good point. And I'm glancing at the time. I know it's about 3 o'clock, so we'll try and we have a couple more slides to get through, but we'll pick up the pace. Contracting and managing that phase, really make sure that contract matches the sales process, and that the delivery matches the contract, and then make sure you have some kind of processes or governance in place to make sure that it continues to match what was promised during the sales process. I'll get into the uncomfortable questions for the vendor, a couple here. First of all, is the deal too skinny? If the vendor is not making money, they're not going to be incentivized to continually invest in this relationship. So, make sure that it's a win-win, especially with these longer-term relationships. Under delivery, we have what percentage of your personnel deliver this service, and what percentage of your customers consume this service? Like, is this something that really is a core competency for the company, or is it something that Carl does often this branch office somewhere, and you never talk to Carl. Make sure you want to make sure that this is something that they're continually investing in. And then I think you mentioned this before under controls, Chris, but who owns the relationship, right? Who is going to get along with who? Who's going to talk to whom, and make sure that this partnership is successful.
Yeah, and I know we're cognizant. I'm trying to be cognizant of time. But one point I want to make on that audit for work thing is one of the things I like to do with vendors is instead of having like a consistently active audit process, especially if you're short on buyers or contract managers, is to kind of flip that on its head and require vendors to report back into you based on whatever KPIs you have. So it's more of a prove that you're working for me the way we said you're going to work for me, rather than editing and auditing work. That's kind of a technique I like to use if I'm short on staff.
And you bet, that's one of the recommendations we have coming out of this. So we're just coming up on the last section. In terms of review, what we covered here is what are IT services. We talked about why a company would work with an IT services firm, and the cost models between procurement, projects, and managed services. The ask moving forward is making sure that you feel equipped to go out and audit one of your IT services vendor. This is a great exercise to go through just to make sure that you're getting the full value of that agreement. So I have listed out a few activities here for what we do when we do an audit of another IT services company. The objective is to find typically $50,000 worth of business value. That makes the effort worth it. Now that can come from a reduction in rates. It can come from making sure that the vendor is providing everything they're contracted to do, that kind of thing. So the activities we recommend going out and first of all reviewing all the contracts and documentation that come along with these things. Right, what was signed originally 3-4 years ago when everyone was different. And then a 360-degree survey of the vendor, which includes interviewing the executive sponsor, the primary contact, any users that might interface with that vendor or be impacted by it, stakeholders, and then of course the vendor themselves, and have a conversation about what's being delivered and walk through the agreement and make sure that it's what was originally promised. After you go through that, you should have a good sense of what objective metrics should exist, I guess, for gauging performance. And then you should be able to grade the way the vendor has performed over the past 6-month term or so, based on those metrics that were either established during the contracting phase or just what everyone perceives as being the most important things. You might get a third-party perspective, someone else take a look at it, and networks like this are a great way to do that. And then develop some recommendations that go back to whoever that executive sponsor is, right? Like this needs to be rebid, a quarterly business review cadence needs to be set up, or whatever it is going to deliver that $50,000 in business value. So the outputs from that are going to be some kind of final report and recommendation, a vendor management framework at the start of that. It can be very sophisticated. Insight for your next RFP, and then a vendor audit template. You might want to have some of your staff run through this, for one vendor a month or one vendor a quarter, and just work your way through all of them related to IT. And that's the presentation. So again, the ask moving forward is to go out and try and find a vendor you can audit and ask them uncomfortable questions too, and understand what you're getting out of the agreement. And yeah, if I can do anything to help with that, or of course Chris as well, we're always around and available.
Absolutely.